The Executive Director of the Saratoga Springs Preservation Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're thrilled to have this program. I'm sure we're all going to learn a lot and see some really great historic photographs and really learn some great things about our wonderful city. Before we get started, I just want to briefly say to those of you who may not be familiar with the Saratoga Springs Preservation Foundation, we were started in 1977 and we are celebrating our 45th year. Our mission is to preserve and enhance the architectural and cultural landscape heritage of Saratoga Springs. We do this through educational programs like our program tonight. We also do this through summer strolls every Sunday. We have walking tours. We do other programs throughout the year. So be sure to check out our website, to learn more about our educational programs. In addition to our educational programs, we obviously advocate preservation practices within the city, exterior changes, as well as new construction. Preservation doesn't just happen, it takes effort. Also, we provide assistance to builders as well as restoration projects. We've been involved with the Spirit Spencer Memorial partnership with the city of Saratoga Springs. We also help the first with endangered stained glass and we currently have a project at 65 Street. We look forward to having that progress in the spring as we've encountered, like many people, challenges with construction and contractors. But we're excited about that. One of the things that I want to share tonight that's very relevant with tonight's program is that on February 9th at 6 o'clock, the city is hosting a public meeting about the proposed changes to Union Avenue. That may include reducing Union Avenue down to one lane each way with a turning lane, adding bike lanes and making other changes. There is no plan that's been presented yet to this point. However, that has been shared as a possibility. For those of you who are interested about the future of Union Avenue and how those changes may impact the historic and appearance of this grand entrance into our city, I encourage you to attend this event. And again, that's Thursday, February 9th. Moving on, I just want to thank everyone who made a donation tonight to this program. You are not only you are supporting preservation by doing so and help to make these programs possible. With that said, I would also like to again remind all of you that we are a membership-based organization. So if you're not already a member, I would really encourage you to join. With that, you get benefits such as discounts to events, summer strolls, and other aspects for you. And you help us to be a strong voice for preserving our wonderful community. Which brings me to some business items before we turn it over to Charlie. And that would be to remain muted throughout the whole program. If you have any questions, please use the chat feature. It's at the bottom of your screen. Jackie Mungy, who our events and programs coordinator, will be moderating that chat. So will I. So again, please use that feature to ask questions. With that, I'm prepared to introduce our illustrious presenter, Charlie Kuenzel, dear friend, wonderful historian, and partner in crime about caring about our history and sharing it with people. Charlie is a native Saratogian who's taught in the Saratoga City School District for 36 years. and was co-owner of Saratoga Tours LLC for almost 20 years. Charlie is the current president of the Saratoga Springs History Museum, who we love to partner with, and is a wonderful organization. I encourage you to support them as well, and writes regular history articles like I do for Simply Saratoga and Saratoga Today. And he's a speaker on many historic topics. Like, his wealth of knowledge is like almost mind-numbing to me, but I'm glad he's always willing to share his knowledge with us. And with that, he's entertained audiences for over 30 years. So I'm gonna have Charlie, I'm gonna turn it over to him, and you'll need to unmute yourself, and we will take the show away. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Samantha, for that introduction. I appreciate it. And right back at you. Those of us that are in leadership roles down at the Saratoga Springs History Museum love partnering with preservation. That, I think, is one of the best or nicest things that happens in the city of Saratoga, is the fact that on a regular basis, so many of us get together and collaborate. Collaboration has, especially during COVID, showed us the power that we could do together, and we'll continue to do that in the future. So let's see if we can get right into our show for tonight. Not able to advance, people. Thank you. As Samantha and you all know, because you signed up for this, On the Streets Where You Live is the title for tonight. And let me just preface everything by saying this. After 36 years in the classroom and 20 years on probably almost 300 conventions a year and keynotes and stuff over the years, you always, as a presenter or as a teacher, and that's what I still consider myself, you look for new ways in which to bring the history of Saratoga alive, different ways, different delivery systems. And tonight I'm trying something a little bit different. Dave Patterson, my old business partner at Saratoga Tours, we had tried some of this before about trying to deeply get into the history of the city by trying to jog your memory when you look at street signs. Because the street signs in any municipality, whether it's one where you live or one where you travel, is going to be loaded with historical thoughts and ideas. In some cases, as you'll find in a few minutes, some of our namings were kind of random, but quite often they had a lot of thought to them and a reflection of what the Saratoga history has been. So today we've got a very sprawling city. Believe it or not, on a geographic or square mile area, we rank 5th in the state of New York. New York City, of course, is first, and then we get, believe it or not, Rome, New York, and then Rochester and Buffalo, and then finally Saratoga Springs. We're all over the place, and I guess that's what gave us the incentive to be the city in the country, because with the proper zoning, which we have, you can have a downtown area, you can have a more urban look, and then as you spread out, you get more acreage, and the residential requirements change for builders and contractors and stuff. So as a result, the city has a lot of different elements, and we need a lot of streets and things in order to accommodate that sprawl. So let's take a look back at, this is a bolster collection picture. By the way, for those of you that are not familiar with the Saratoga History Museum, we're located in historic Congress Park in the Canfield Casino. And we are the custodians of 325,000 pictures that were part of George S. Bolster's photographic collection. We've digitized approximately 17,000 of them right now that allow you fairly easy access on the internet in order to look at them and use for research and then get printed later if that's what you need. But it gives us a look back into different parts of Saratoga history. And of course, this is Broadway. And to the left of the picture would be the intersection of Division Street. So you might recognize some of the structures to the right, but overall, a lot of things have changed as this picture shows. Here's another one. This is Broadway at Church. You probably recognize the Adirondack Trust Bank on the left, Menges and Curtis on the right with the drug sign. And then just beyond that is the silhouette of City Hall. So Church Street would be coming in from the left where the post office is and continuing down to Lake Avenue on the right. And this is one of my favorites. I love this picture because it's from a different era. It's where the United States Hotel was located on the left, which is very close to Division Street. But it was in a time before automobiles and the cobblestone streets. I don't know, it kind of paints a neat picture of what it must have sounded like as the horses clip-clop their way down on those warm summer days in Saratoga in years gone past. But when Gideon and DeWanda Putnam arrived, this is the way Saratoga kind of looked. They were responsible for so much in the early days. Saratoga was in the early 1800s being eclipsed by Boston Spa. They were ahead of us in terms of being a resort destination. And Saratoga Springs was really situated in the middle of a great pine wood forest. And thank goodness, Gideon and DeWanda not only had foresight, but Gideon had a business he was a lumberman. So he would take the trees down and kind of cart them up to his sawmill, which was on the north end of the city, and turn them into dimensional lumber that could be used for all kinds of construction work. Because we were having a very fast-paced city pretty soon that's going to need a lot of lumber to build a lot of houses. And it was the work of Gideon and DeWanda that started to lay out the streets of Saratoga. Broadway, or Broad Street as it was originally coined, was laid out with the help of DeWanda. DeWanda, I've spoke on her a few times. There's been some very powerful women in history of Saratoga, and she's one of them. But she helped to lay out Broadway at 120 feet from curb to curb. And maybe some of you have heard this story in past lectures or talks I've given, or what Dave and I have done in the past. And Dave and I used to argue, banter, whatever, about a lot of different things over the years. And one of the things that we initially agreed on, which was kind of interesting, was that we thought Gideon was a genius. And we kind of anchored that with the idea that he knew that in 1802, when they were laying out Broad Street, by making it wide and very broad at 120 feet, that it would allow in the future for 2 lanes of traffic north, 2 lanes south with parking on both sides. And we just thought he was such a visionary. Well, probably about 15, 18 years ago, we found a correspondence where he talked about when he was felling the trees and putting them on this large wood cart pulled by a large team of horses. In order to turn that cart around, took 120 feet. So the man was practical too. But Broadway comes in at a very wide site, which gives us a real interesting dimension and feel to the city today. As you notice in this picture, Washington Street, Congress, those were all initially laid out at 66 feet. And a lot of it was due to the fact that that was just what he decided. And I want to mention this. In one of his original thoughts was he never wanted anybody to own a spring. He was hoping that the springs, the mineral springs that were being found and the ones that were in operation at the time he arrived, would be placed in the middle of the streets with the idea that traffic wouldn't be encumbered by it, because it was so slow back then, and that people could stop and take the waters, but being in the middle of the street, nobody would ever own it. Well, that didn't last long. So they all got moved onto private property, and eventually that became the norm here in Saratoga. The laying out of those first streets was in the south part of the village. There was actually 2 villages that started. One that was up near High Rock, that was called the Upper Village, and another one that was near where Gideon built his tavern and boarding house, which is directly across from the Arts Center and the entrance to Congress Park. The upper and lower villages were 2 distinct ones for a few years, and then eventually they kind of grew together. And it's generally inferred in a lot of the thoughts that When you take a look down Broadway on a very quiet Sunday morning or sometime when there's not a lot of traffic, you notice that there's kind of a little jog in it right near Division Street, which Division Street was named for the boundary line between Livingston and Hathorne's, or excuse me, I'm sorry, Henry Walton's properties. Henry Walton was a very forward-thinking man. He owned a lot of land that was north of Congress Street. And what he did was rented a lot of it with the option to buy, which was a brilliant move. And that's what Gideon DeWanda did. They rented 300 acres, then eventually bought it, and then started to lay out the streets. Here's a map from April of 1810 that we'll look at in a little more detail. But this is the way the city was starting to be laid out. Notice, and I'll get you a better picture right now, the lands that Gideon was working with initially, which is shown here, he set out to make different building lots. And the Marvin brothers did the same thing on the west side of town up near Franklin Square. And we'll talk about that later. But what it did was it allowed immediately for people of maybe lesser economic means to say, let's save and try to buy one of those and get in the heart of the city. You'll notice in this picture, there is on Washington Street, a depiction of a church. And there is just to the left of that, if you can see it on your screen, there, believe it or not, that structure is a schoolhouse. Gideon was very forward thinking. I think he and DeWanda were good in so many ways, but they donated land for the first church, the first school, the first cemetery. So they even advocated for parks, as so did John Clark, and we'll learn about him later. But eventually, these places are going to be more defined and bought up from Henry Walton until finally, there's going to be quite a layout of the early city, all based right around Broadway. Now, if we're going to talk eventually, which I want to, I'm going to do almost 86 different streets here tonight. We'll attempt that, see if we have time for such things. But a lot of the power families, I'm going to call them power families in early Saratoga. The Putnam family was one. Judge Henry Walton and his family was one. And of course, Livingston was also. So for instance, initially, right off the bat, if you hear the name Putnam Street, it's named after the Putnam family. Washington Street, a lot of people think Washington is named after George. It is Washington Putnam. It was one of the Putnam family's boys. Caroline Street, that's up for grabs. The Putnam family had a granddaughter named Caroline, but Judge Henry Walton did also. So in one fashion or another, one of those two people were the responsibility for the naming of Caroline Street. But Phila Street is the interesting one. It was mixed up in the old travel guides in the 1800s. A lot of times they would discuss things or properties that were owned on Phila. And in parentheses, 9 times out of 10, they said short for Philadelphia Street. That is not the case. Phila was the last child born to the Putnams, and she was honored with the name Phila Street, named after her. Now, Judge Henry Walton's family, of course, was big landowners. So Walton Street right away. Matilda Street. Matilda Street is going to be named after Henry Walton's wife. I was giving a talk at the Lions Club today, and I happened to mention in passing Matilda Street, and a lot of puzzled looks came over people's faces because they hadn't heard of or knew where Matilda Street is. Well, that's for good reason. It's been renamed. It's Woodlawn Avenue now, but that was named after the Walton family. Caroline Street, I've already discussed. Henry and William Street were named after Henry Walton's 2 sons. So right away, you know, we gravitate back to the fact that these people were power families. They were instrumental in the early years, and therefore, why not have those names? Washington Street, Putnam Street, Caroline, and Phila were all laid out by the Putnam family along with Broadway. So, and then finally, I kind of alluded to this earlier. Division Street's a neat place because it gets its name. It's one of the earliest streets in Saratoga as the boundary, the division between the land of Walton and Livingston. So again, my goal tonight is when you're driving or walking around Saratoga and you look at a street sign, I'm hoping that the street sign begins to jog a memory of what is the intrinsic history of the city that would have caused us to honor the people, the family, or the event with a street name. John Clark is going to arrive in Saratoga 1823, comes up from New York City. He has made his money in soda fountains in New York City, and he's going to build this large house that's on Circular Street, and he's going to make a big push to make a street that is circular. And he's going to buy the land and move down what we call Circular Street today, makes the turn by the Bachelor Mansion and heads toward Broadway. When he gets to the intersection of Circular and Broadway, his intent was to cross, of course, Broadway and continue in a circular fashion on the west side and kind of bring it around. Unfortunately, the landowners at the time over on the other side didn't want to sell to him. So it eventually was continued, but not in the pattern of a circular street as his original hope was. But still, it was kind of unique. Little side note on this, in that period, the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and beyond, almost all the streets, whether it was in New York City or even in places like Saratoga, were laid out in grid patterns. It was just the common way of doing it. And Circular Street was such an odd name that Irving Menges, who owned Menges and Curtis in the early days, had a friend send a letter to him, and it was addressed Irving Menges Circular Street, and that was it. And the post office worked real hard to make the delivery. And when they were kind of questioned as to how they figured it out, they said, as far as we know, Circular Street's the only one that's of its kind in the United States. And again, because of its shape. He's going to go ahead and lay out the land that he owns behind that house, White Street and Clark Street and Regent Street. Of course, those are all going to be named after bottling, which we'll get into in a minute. But he starts to lay out those streets behind Union Avenue in a way to try to attract affordable housing, smaller frontage building lots, whereas Union Avenue was going to be an upscale neighborhood and had a lot of frontage. So there was even talk with some of our early designers and planners to have more affordable housing in Saratoga Springs. Now, I threw this one in. South Street was named after the fact that it was the southernmost street in the city at one point. And in 1861, a lot of houses were starting to be built on South Street. And as they were coming into view, they felt that, well, they're going to start to build beyond that. Couldn't they put a better name to it? So it was called, or renamed part of it, good portion of it, Lincoln Avenue. And then from that, we get all the presidential streets that we'll talk about later that are going to be ancillary to that. So South Street becomes Lincoln Avenue. The wealthiest neighborhood in the city initially was Franklin Square. It was an area that the Marvin brothers, who were instrumental not only in local government and at the state level, but also with the United States Hotel and even more, were great landowners on the west side. They're going to help to lay out the streets that we call the tree streets, the elms and the oaks and all that. And the reason is they are noticing there's a huge influx of workers coming in that are definitely blue collar laborers that are good people that want to own their own house. And again, you've got to have the right size building lot in order to meet their needs on an economic basis. So as a result, they started laying out what we call the tree streets. But the area around Franklin Square stayed very upscale. And as I say on this slide, it was the earliest, wealthiest neighborhood. Now, the funny part is the city of Saratoga and its so many vocal people at the time, just like today, decided that they wanted to call this Marvin Square. And they really petitioned hard and pushed hard, and they were going to name it Marvin Square. And the two Marvin brothers decided that that was a little bit too much for them to take, and they felt that that neighborhood deserved a more fitting name maybe to somebody that was a little bit more influential in American history and not just local history. And that's why it picked up the name Franklin after Benjamin Franklin. And that was the advocation of the two Marvin brothers. Otherwise, if you go back far enough, it's all Marvin Square that people are talking about. On the east side of town, especially on Circular Street, we're going to get the Jamel House. And that was the summer home of Madame Elijah Jamel. And she had made great strides with her husband's wine business. He was a wine merchant tied very strongly to France. And unfortunately, there was an accident with a horse-drawn cart and a head trauma that resulted in his early demise. She took over the businesses and turned a great profit and literally became the largest landowner on the east side of Saratoga. From about Circular Street, she owned pretty much all the property to about where exit 1415. So she was a big player in the early days. Elijah Jamel. And as the 19th century progressed, the development of the city also progressed. On the left, we've got Morrissey's Clubhouse. Remember, it wasn't called the Canfield Casino at the time. It was called the Saratoga Clubhouse, partially because they wanted to disguise the fact that there was illegal gambling going on there, but that got to be known pretty quick. But the clubhouse was there, and you'll notice the street that's in front of it, that's East Congress. Even today, there's only one structure on East Congress, and that's the Canfield Casino. And on the left side of the picture, you'll notice a corner, and that was the intersection of East Congress and, believe it or not, Putnam Street. Putnam Street runs from past Ben and Jerry's down and intersects with Spring Street today. It used to continue on down into Congress Park at one point. So I always kind of kid that when John Morrissey was buying this piece of property to put in his clubhouse, it wasn't far-fetched to think that location still was a big part, because this was a corner lot. And I don't know everybody that's in the audience tonight, but I also make the joke, and I think I have pretty good footing on this, that probably if this was for sale today, it'd be a Stewart's, but it became the clubhouse. The Saratoga racetrack, which was also given credit from Morrissey's idea, along with Jerome and Travers and others. The race course was laid out just up the street. And just for those of you that maybe have not been in Saratoga for very long, East Congress used to go right up directly and go into a nice continuation into Union Avenue. Now we've got the Gray Ghost up there, Native Dancer, which is a beautiful pocket park, but that is what prevents transportation from connecting. But they used to connect at one point. All of this is part of it. As you build a race course, you got to build roads to it. As you build a clubhouse, you got to put in roads. All these things are going to be named, and we'll look at those in more detail later. Eventually, the wealthy neighborhoods are going to move out of Franklin Square, and they're going to move to North Broadway and to Union Avenue. And that's all going to be post-American Civil War. A lot of the industrial titans that came out of, believe it or not, Troy, New York, that made huge amounts of money during the American Revolution, ended up building large houses that are still there today on North Broadway. And a lot of their communications used to say that they were going to Saratoga for the summer to go camping, because they felt that their houses on North Broadway were a little more modest than what they were used to. Union Avenue filled in as the track did, and produced, again, a very upscale neighborhood. What I like to do, and I don't know if any of you that dabble in local history like to do, I like to get a hold of the old travel guides. And the travel guides were written every year and published and distributed and sold in the Northeast United States for the most part. And a lot of people bought them in order to find out what the hotels were doing in Saratoga and eventually beyond. They eventually picked up Cape Cod and Niagara Falls and places like that. But I'm totally fascinated by reading their exposés on Saratoga, because they give you glimpses as to where the most money is and where the wealthy are building and what's the most prominent streets and stuff like that. And there is a time when there is a changeover in 1870s, early 1870s, where they start to talk about the opulence of Union Avenue and North Broadway. So let's take some names for a minute. This is looking down Lake Avenue from Broadway, and we've got City Hall on the left and the old Saratogian building kind of on the right a little bit. But here's a list of names. We used to always joke that Lake Avenue was named Lake Avenue because it goes to the lake, but it doesn't go to the lake anymore. Church Street had churches on it, but it doesn't have churches on it anymore. Van Dam Street, named after one of the original landowners from the Caterosser's patent, Rip Van Dam, who had received land. The Caterosser's patent was a little invention by Queen Anne in England in 1708. She gave away approximately 800,000 acres of land that she really didn't own, but she was giving it to people that had been friendly to the crown. And large allotments were given to certain people. And a good portion of Saratoga was given to just a handful of people. And Van Dam happened to be, Rip Van Dam happened to be one that had most of the city. Woodlawn Avenue was Matilda Street originally, but renamed because Judge Hilton, by the 1870s, had started to build an estate up where Skidmore campus is today. And it was named at that point Woodlawn. And the road that was extended to go up there, originally called Matilda, was renamed Woodlawn Avenue. Circular Street we've covered because of the intended shape of it. Railroad Place is easy because that's where the first trains came in 1832 on July 1st. We got only the second rail line in the city of, or in the state of New York, coming into Saratoga, which revolutionized our summer visitors. I included Plank Road here. I managed to do all the fourth graders every year as a part of outreach with local history units at the museum. Plank Road's in Greenfield, but I always like to kind of interject it. Plank Road was in Greenfield coming down from the area up near Lake Desolation. And Plank Road was a toll road. And the reason it was built and used as a toll road was because Oscar Granger was a glass blower who was, a deal was made with him with John Clark, who was the first one to bottle waters at Saratoga, to make over 1 million bottles a year up on the mountain. And they used the sand and the hemlock up there for fire and for heat, and managed to blow all these great glass bottles that had to be filled, but they had to be taken down the mountain. And the bumpy roads at the time usually resulted in a fair amount of product loss. So as a result of that, they made a plank road that was going to get our bottles to us. So does Plank Road in Greenfield have something to do with Saratoga? I think so. Let's talk about Gardner Lane for a minute. In 1830, there was a gentleman that bought a plot of land down on Putnam Street. His name was Robert Gardner. And he built a house there. And then he decided that he would try to pick up a small 75-foot wide strip that connected up to Broadway. And it's a pathway for him for a good many years, that he would get up in the morning, and when he was ready, he would take that walk up the hill and be up on Broadway in order to get whatever provisions and things he needed for the day. And eventually, so many people followed that path got worn down, and then the city eventually paved it. And it's the small street that sits between N. Fox Jewelers on the east side of Broadway. So it's between the Cantina on the north side and N. Fox on the south side. And that's called Gardner Lane. Sign's still there, I saw it today. Lafayette Street, that was named after the fact that the Marquis de Lafayette included Saratoga in 1824 in Lafayette's tour of the United States. So was Lafayette in Saratoga? Yes. Is it an important thing then to honor him with that street? I think so. Greenfield Avenue. Why? Because it used to go to Greenfield. So here's some more names. East Avenue, believe it or not, at one point was the furthest street east. West, the same. South Street, also, I kind of alluded to that earlier. And then that was renamed, part of it anyhow, Lincoln Avenue. North Street's the exception. North Street is kind of in a funny spot. It's not a north extension or boundary. It was named after Dr. Miles North, who had practiced in Saratoga for quite a while. Jamel Street, named after Elijah Jamel, our big landowner. Warren Street. Warren Street was named after Judge William Warren, who owned not only a lot of the property in the area, but was pretty phenomenal in the early years of Saratoga as a judge. Union Avenue, the name comes as a result of the Grand Army of the Republic. The Northern soldiers that fought, the 77th Regiment that came out of Saratoga, etc. Around the completion of the American Civil War, a lot of things were named after the Union and the soldiers that fought there. A little bit of an interesting thing. I uncovered this in some research I did. Union Avenue is tied to Grand Avenue. Kind of, a lot of people scratch their head when you tell them that. Grand Avenue is a section really of Congress Street. Now, Congress Street was laid out and named after the Congress Spring, which at one point was probably the most well-known mineral spring in the United States. So Congress Street, whether it's East Congress or regular Congress Street, it's got its name tied to the spring. Now, Union Avenue is the continuation. So once they broke with the idea that once you got to Circular Street, the continuation would be called Union Avenue. And again, because of the Union Army, a lot of people began to move there and big palatial houses were built. Well, the people on the west side, and there's always been, even when I was a kid, a rivalry between the east side and the west side. Still kind of exists a little bit today, I guess. Maybe not what it was when I was in Little League and everything, but East and West went against each other. But what they decided to do was rename part of Congress Grand Avenue to give the idea that there were going to be grand houses that would be built on Grand Avenue. And that was on the west side of town, but so what? They could have them too. Clark Street, named after John Clark, who bottles the water first. He and his initial partner, Lynch, get into the bottling business. And our waters are bottled by 1880. We're putting out about 8.3 million bottles of Saratoga water that are being put on almost all the cruise ships to Europe. And believe it or not, being exported as far away as China. So our water was very prolific and got all over the United States, Europe, and also into the Pacific Rim. White Street is named after William White, but the White family was also into bottling. And when he died, the widow married John Clark, and they formed another. If you're into collecting mineral water bottles, you'll find some that are labeled Clark and White, which was a company that was bottling here in Saratoga for a while in the 1800s. Here's some other names for you. We get into Nelson Avenue, Cromlin Drive. Those two are named, believe it or not, for families. The Cromlin estate was on the property that becomes Cromlin Drive, and Nelson Avenue was named after the large Nelson farm that was located out what would become Nelson Avenue. Excelsior Drive, Excelsior Avenue. Excelsior is named after the spring that was right near there, which was a very popular spring. It was on the trolley and the rail line that went out of Saratoga. Pinewood Avenue is a simple one. The builder in that area realized there were a lot of pine trees and just was kind of running on empty, I guess, and decided it would just be Pinewood Avenue. Bryan Street is named after the first permanent settler to Saratoga, Alexander Bryan, who had a log cabin up very close to the footprint of the present day Old Bryan Inn. So he was the first permanent settler in Saratoga. And it's always rumored, I believe it to be true, that when you enter the Old Bryan Inn and to the right, the footprint of the bar is roughly about the same size as the initial log cabin by Alexander Bryan, which was a tavern and boarding house. Seward Street. Seward Street was named after William Henry Seward, who was Secretary of State. who was a good friend of the Walworth family. The Walworth family was a very prominent family that lived on Broadway, and he used to come to visit. And as a result of his many visits to Saratoga to see his friends, the Walworths, Seward Street was named. Beekman Street was named after Johannes Beekman, who was one of the original land designations from the Caterosser's patent. So Beekman Street picks up that name, again, from the early days of the distribution of the land, probably illegally, from Queen Anne in 1708. Eureka Avenue, named after the Eureka Spring that was at the bottom of the hill there. There was the sulfur springs down there too, but the Eureka Spring was very, very popular. So again, there's a little bit of story with each of these if you look deep enough. The presidential streets are going to come in after the renaming of part of South Street to be Lincoln. And then we're going to pick up, Monroe and Jefferson and all those. Steele Street, that's named after Dr. John Steele. Now, Dr. Steele was a physician, but he also decided to dabble pretty in depth with a lot of chemistry. And he did a lot of the chemical analysis of some of our early springs. Others did too, but he was pretty prolific in that. And a lot of times, if you're researching and stuff, you'll find some of his work. And Steele Street was named after Dr. again, John Steele. Avenue of Pines, of course, that's on the property of the Spa State Park, but it's a great name for what it is, an avenue that goes through a bunch of pines that were purposely planted on both sides. And the idea is that they were, in the original plan, spaced evenly all the way down and made for a very majestic passage. Today, I think the same thing is true. Every time I drive down through there, I'm reminded of how beautiful it is. Although the spacing isn't perfect, it's still, what a beautiful spot. Benedict Street is named after Elijah Benedict. He was very instrumental in the building of the first United States hotel. That was in 1824. And that's on the property that today would be thought of as Finger Paint. So it'd be the corner of Division and Broadway, and again, going south on the west side. Potato Chip Lane is up near the track, and what better name, because the potato chip came out of Moon's Lake House in 1853, when George Crumb, we can go into those stories later, when he sliced potatoes very thin for a disgruntled restaurant visitor and cooked them and then salted them heavily and found that he had discovered something that everybody liked. Granger Avenue, I've already, if you were listening, kind of alluded to the fact that Oscar Granger was brought in from Vernon, New York by John Clark. There was an initial contract made for 1 million bottles, hand-blown bottles. And Oscar Granger and his family and 100 glassblowers eventually relocated up onto the top of Lake Desolation up in the town of Greenfield, Providence. And Granger Avenue just reflects the fact that the Grangers had a lot to do with early Saratoga, not only with the waters, but more beyond. Blyven Way is a relatively new one that's out off Weibel Avenue. It's named after the first police chief. Maple Avenue, originally called Front Street. And in a lot of the early maps, you'll see it marked as Front Street. There was a man named Thomas Tompkins who in the early part of the 1850s hand planted, according to all the stuff I could find, approximately 360 maple trees down that Front Street. And of course, after they took root and got pretty good in size, it was pretty logical to call it Maple Avenue instead of Front Street anymore. See, we can do a sidebar on this for just a second. One of the things that was presented in the early years of the city was the idea that the city needed more trees. We were originally covered by white pine, which had been taken down, a lot of it to be taken to the sawmills and stuff. But there was a need for shade. There was no mechanical refrigeration or air conditioning at the time. So as a result, tree shading was very important. So there was a credit to your highway taxes. If you were a resident and a landowner in Saratoga, you paid highway tax. And for every tree that you could show you planted each year, every new tree received 46 2/3 cents reduction in your street tax. So Maple Avenue is just kind of a nice way of kind of remembering that. I put this one in. There's the Worden Hotel on the right-hand side. And the street that's going to be a little bit more to the left of the picture is Division Street. This is something I'd like you to kind of think about the next time you're in downtown Saratoga. This is going to be the intersection of Broadway and Division. So it's kind of right across from N Fox, right across from Uncommon Grounds, let's say. If you look in this picture to the left, you'll notice that there is a porch. That's a porch that was constructed in the new rendition, the new edition of the United States Hotel. Now, the United States Hotel went all the way back to Railroad Place and covered about 6 acres. But this porch that was erected eventually got the nickname Millionaire's Row because almost everybody that sat out on that porch was a millionaire. And a lot of business deals were done out there. So as a result, that was kind of an added feature. And in order to make it all fit, they moved Division Street. So Division Street moved from the south to the north. The north corner of it became the south, etc. Next time you're on Broadway at that location, look up Division, and you'll notice if you look up far enough towards Spot Coffee, you'll notice how Division Street takes a little bit of a jog to the left and then straightens out as it goes into Franklin Square. That's because they moved the street. So it's kind of an interesting thought. A lot of these big hotels, like here's the Congress Hall, which sat right where the Spirit of Life is and the park, and all the way down to Spring Street. We had, and take a look at the street. Broadway widens here. This was called Monument Square. And eventually, once automobiles were in operation, the statue that was there of the 77th Regiment was moved from the middle of the street because of a car accident that resulted in the ejection of one of the passengers. A head injury was very traumatic in that accident. So they didn't want to have that continue. So they pulled that and moved it inside Congress Park. And that's the one that we, our last commissioner, Skip Scirocco for DPW, was so on top of trying to get fixed after vandalism occurred in the park. And that 77th Regiment still stands there today. Grand Union Hotel was a massive hotel, and that stretched all the way from Congress Street, named after Congress Spring, all the way down to Washington. And again, Washington Street was named after Washington Putnam. Here's an aerial view of downtown Broadway in those early days. You can see the massive size. If you look, it's hard, I know, with this size, et cetera, depending on the size of your screen, but the size of the hotels and just the amount of acreage, and then the big buildings that we're going to start to line, just like they do today, the east and west sides of Broadway. So the city begins to grow. And as they grow, of course, the boundaries are going to grow. So we need new streets and we need new names. And the areas that were the edge of the city are now going to be incorporated today inside the city. Now, I always tell this story, and I'm sometimes laughed at, but I grew up near East Avenue on Avery Street. And there were a lot of vacant lots back then, a million years ago. And we used to find that some of those vacant lots were the actual old dumps for the big hotels. So we would go and dig bottles and look for silverware and stuff like that in the old dumps. But what it brings up is the idea that East Avenue was one of the furthest points, and they were taking their trash to the furthest point of the city to dump it. Again, that big change. And of course, as you grow, you need new names and new streets. So here's a few more. So these are some of the ones that are going to be added then. We're going to have Patricia Lane, which is named after the daughter of the developer that was building the houses in that area. Wagner Road is named after the first family that actually built a house there. Elizabeth Lane was the wife of the developer in that area. His last name was Buffardi. McAllister Drive, that was the first family that built a house on that street, so they named it after the family. Lefferts a road or avenue, I should say, Lefferts Avenue was named after Derek Lefferts, who was kind of a prominent citizen in Saratoga in the early years. Meadowbrook Road and Brook Road were named after gambling casinos. Gambling casinos were there, and then the roads were added later. And they had the name Meadowbrook and also just Brook. So we get that. Family names are used a lot of times. So Gilbert Road, Gick Road, Henning Road, Gridley, all named after families. George Street is named after George Mitchell, who was the brother of Caleb Mitchell, who was an early mayor president of the city of Saratoga. Andrews Street was named after the Andrews family that lived on Andrews Street. Alger Street was named for Dr. W.S. Alger, who practiced medicine in Saratoga. And on the slide, the last one, Bensonhurst Avenue, was the name of the company that was selling the building lots in that area. So it was fitting that as the building lots are being sold, what are we going to name the avenue? We'll name it Bensonhurst. As the city grows, the look of the city is going to change. On the left, you've got Lafayette Street and Circular, and the number of trees, the houses that are there are going to undergo revision and renovation and stuff. But the basics are there. The main arteries are there. It's just going to change in shape. So it's fun to look back through the old Bolster collection and take a look at what the landscapes of the neighborhoods look like too, which could be on its own talk. On the right, we've got Spring Street coming all the way down from Broadway. And this shows the bridge that connected the Congress Hall Hotel on the right and the ballroom that was built specifically as the ballroom for the Congress Hall. And that bridge connected the two. And with a little bit of an eye, if you look at Spring Street, you'll notice how it hadn't been paved at this point. And if it rained and weather was bad, not good for traveling to parties. So that's why the bridge was a necessity. And that's why Henry Hathorne constructed that, to make it easier for his guests to move from the main hotel into the ballroom for the nightly dances. This picture on the left is one of my favorites. This is Fifth Avenue looking east, 1936. You can see the crossroad of East Avenue. And to the right, those trees that are there, the property behind it is the Oklahoma training track. W.C. Whitney is going to lay that out in 1901. Well, what I like about this is in 1936, where are the houses? This is pushing out the boundaries of the city, even in the 1900s. And I put this one on Spring Street in Putnam. We had the Hathorne #1 spring underneath that cover that's there. That got moved when the parking garage was built. So we have a parking garage there. Of course, the spring is now on the other side of the street. So again, you're not moving all these streets, but you're definitely changing things. And the look changes with the buildings adjacent. So let's do a few more streets. Clinton Street, named after Governor George Clinton, who 1783 visited High Rock with George Washington and possibly Alexander Hamilton, but for sure General Philip Schuyler. Marvin, named after the Marvin brothers. Grove Street was named after the fact that that area had a lot of pine trees, and they were used to refer to it as the Pine Grove. That's where the Walworth family lived, and it's right near where the city center is today. And Grove Street just picked up the name Grove, and they didn't include Pine Grove because Pine Grove was the name of the Walworth family. Rock Street came down and connected with High Rock Spring. Again, shortened just to Rock Street. Spring Street, we looked at a couple pictures of that. The original name of Spring Street was Bath. Bath Street was named, and then again, another hotel, the Congress Hall, was being built. And as they were getting ready to build that, they needed a little more space. So they literally picked up Bath Street and moved it 60 feet to the north in that case, and then straightened it out and had it continue all the way up to Circular Street and renamed it Spring Street. Waterbury Street, named after the Waterbury family, which was very prominent in the city of Saratoga. Again, these are all just, each one of them you could do a lengthy talk on in terms of what was their contribution to the city, et cetera. We just don't have the time to get 86 streets and all the nitpick on the history. Dyer Switch, kind of on the outskirts of Saratoga. That was where the train would make it switch, so you could pick whether you wanted to go to Saratoga Lake or if you were going to Schuylerville. And they also picked up loads of molding sand there. So they would then bring that back into the city because they were making bottles. Clement Avenue. Clement Avenue was named after Joel Clement, citizen. Colville Avenue was named after the Colville family. Vanderbilt, the Vanderbilt family doesn't need any explanation, I don't think, on that. And the Weibel Avenue was named after a family that had a number of houses initially on that street, Weibel Avenue. York Avenue is kind of funny because it was originally called New York Avenue. And then for some reason, and I've never been able to find it, they dropped new and just made it York Avenue. More streets. Let's just keep going. Webster Street, named after Daniel Webster. He was in Saratoga. Yes, anybody was in Saratoga. We were the #1 tourist destination in the United States in the 1800s. They came en masse. The wealthy and the prominent were all here. Wright Street was named after James H. Wright. His family built one of the first houses on Wright Street. Van Dorn was named after W.C. Van Dorn. He was the son-in-law of N.H. Waterbury, who was the patriarch of the Waterbury family in those early days in Saratoga. So again, we pick up Van Dorn being part of the family name for Waterbury, and that's why they're pretty close to each other. Ritchie Place, the first house that was built on Ritchie Place was owned by a Ritchie family member. Van Rensselaer, family name. Again, a lot of Dutch influence in this area. The Van Rensselaer family has a long history in and around Saratoga. Hodgman Street, named after a carpenter, a builder. He was responsible for building the Jamel House. So that small street that kind of runs behind the Lake Avenue Fire Department is Hodgman Street. Franklin Street, named after Benjamin Franklin, but really after Franklin Square. So we've got a ton of different things that have been named with historical figures and different events and things, but it's all because Saratoga was what it was. We never, I don't think, really had to scratch our head real hard for some of these street names, because we had a lot of history to draw from. And we started to reinvent ourselves in the 1950s after the lake houses closed and the big hotels came down, and we started to market ourselves as the king of resorts and the queen of spas. And all of a sudden the slogan is going to come in, health, history, horses. And like Dave and I used to say, they got it right. They came initially for the health. The history's always been here. And the horses were added later in 1863. And then we get even better. Saratoga is good at reinventing itself. It really, really is. The Northway is going to come through and pass this area in 1963 and then go beyond, which is going to add a tremendous conduit for people to get here quicker, especially with their cars. 9N and Route 9 were going to be kind of replaced by the more rapid Northway traffic. Citizens in Saratoga are going to mass together. I remember as a student collecting, believe it or not, pennies to help build SPAC. And we used to have penny drives all the time. So one of the jewels of the city, SPAC, came in during that period of time. In the 1960s, we're going to have a few problems also. Convention Hall is going to burn down. That's going to take away from us a spot for conventions. We were very, very prominent with conventions. Then in the 1980s, we're going to rebuild and we're going to put together the city center, which now is an incredible asset to the city. And having had my own business and working strongly with the Convention and Tourism Bureau, I know exactly what they bring into the city, and it's a real magnet for development in the city. Urban renewal is going to take down the big hotels, and they're going to be replaced by strip malls. That was the thing of the day, but there's all changes which are going to be rectified later, but we're going to change the way we look. Skidmore College is going to move from the downtown area, and that's where names like Skidmore Hall and stuff are still there, but it's going to move up to where Woodlawn is, to the campus that it has today. So we're changing the streets a little bit. We're adding new streets. We're adding what's there and who's using what. By the 1970s, we're going to move the rail station from Railroad Place. We'll move it out onto West Avenue. DPW is going to start doing a wonderful job of restoration of Congress Park and all the assets we have there. And because I work in the park usually 6 days a week, most of the year, at the Canfield Casino, I have to tell you, during the height of the summer season, it's usually the buzz among our visitors about how wonderful Congress Park is and what an asset it is. And it really is. And we have a lot of people to thank for keeping it clean and restored, including the Preservation Foundation. I know Sam did a lot of work with the 2015 restoration of the Spirit of Life. And of course, in 77, preservation is going to come to Saratoga, and thank God for that. Urban renewal is going to continue in certain pockets, but we're moving in good directions during that period. And eventually we can kind of sit back and look at the city now, and it has definitely changed again. I know in my lifetime, I'm asked that question a lot. Do I like it? Do I hate it? What's different? What's new, etc. And as I've said in some of my articles and some of the things I say, my talks, different doesn't mean bad. It just means different. And we change as a country in our needs and our wants. And the picture of what Saratoga was at the height of the 1800s on the left is definitely not what we have today. It doesn't mean it's bad. It doesn't mean it's good. It just means it's different. And the city and the people that are in the city, and I believe that a lot of this is due to the fabric of the city is steeped in its history. People enjoy our city. They're proud of our city. And as a result, it will continue to move in a proper upward move. So are things going to change? Yes. But the people in the streets where we live are probably going to stay pretty much the same. So I want to thank everybody for joining us for this talk, and especially Preservation and Samantha for hosting me. It's always good to be able to come and talk. And I guess we've got some questions, I think. If you have anything that you want to direct at me, I'll be glad to try to take questions at this point.
Charlie, thank you so much. I'm sure, like everybody else, we learned a lot tonight, and like I see people applauding. So I wanted to share something that I learned recently with our house histories, thanks to the wonderful research of Mitch Cohen, who helps us with our house history program that is still on hold, unfortunately, because we have such a backlog. So don't get too excited. The Alger family was active in land speculation, and they Granite and Alger. And Alger obviously referenced their, but they came from and Mary was born in New Hampshire, hence the reference to Granite Street. And Alger Street was named after the family because if one doesn't have the opportunity, they do. So share those little tidbits that I recently learned about street names. Different questions. I did want to acknowledge that Lee mentioned that a lot of these streets were named during when actually it was the not take place until 1915. There was a question about where can someone still see the like where do you look at the Saratoga Springs Public Library?
Yeah, those travel guides can be found. Believe it or not, I've been very lucky. We get contacted on a regular basis by people that want to donate things. So we have a few at the museum in our archives. Saratoga Room has some, and sometimes you can find them online that have been preserved in that fashion. But I've written a few articles using those as the basis of it. They give you a real good glimpse back into time as to what was going on here. So yeah, there's a couple of spots. Go see Michelle down at the Saratoga Room, or stop in. We're closed right now for renovation, but you can always contact us at the History Museum, and we'll set up an actual appointment time for you to come in, and we'll look for those for you. So yeah.
Another question that we had was, you mentioned Webster and Gridley and Wright, but they're kind of by the President's streets. Do you know why they were put where they were, even though they were near the President's streets? If not, that's okay. We know that they were named after for different reasons, but I that was one of the questions.
No, I mean, I think what you have to do in all of this is you have to take a bunch of steps back, and in 1 hour, I don't have the time, unfortunately, to do all of those intermediate steps. But if you could get snapshots of the development of the city every year or every 10 years, every decade, you would start to see where new housing was coming in. And there were hotspots in town where new houses, the President Street's a good example, where a lot of houses were put down in a fairly short amount of time. Just like up near St. Clements off Lake Avenue, those developments were big when I was younger. And they were building houses at a fast rate. Geyser Crest, we can go on and on. And I think what you're doing is you're looking at pops of development that at the time, they're looking at trends in the area, and they're looking for something maybe that's similar, and trying to fill a need. So a lot of this is lost too. I'll be very, very honest with you. There's a discussion over Catherine Street. There's discussion, as I already told you, over Caroline Street. Which family was it? I mean, we hear all the time, oh, it was Henry Walton's granddaughter, but there's other indications that it could have been another granddaughter that was part of the Putnam family. And Catherine Street, that could have been one family or another family. And a lot of that just kind of disappears because probably people didn't really archive that or decide that that was probably going to be very popular. I used a lot of the work that B. Sweeney did in our archives for this, and I have to applaud her for the work she's done, and others like her. You know, as they always say, you know, how did you get to this particular thing? Well, I stood on the shoulder of giants, and those people in the early days that did so much research and things that we have helped us get even further. But a lot of it's lost, and the real essence of what my talk was trying to be tonight was to take a look whenever you travel, but even in your city where you grow up or live, take a look at those names and then dig and say, why? Why did they pick this or that? There's a story there. And I love little stories. Unfortunately, 86 stories would have taken a little bit more time than we had tonight, or anybody, as my family would say, nobody needs to listen to Charlie that long. So, you know, we had to kind of curtail it, but I think it's another way in which to study the history of your city and take a little bit more pride in it. So,
Absolutely.
sorry for the long answer, Sam.
No, it's a good one. Another question was, and you may not know the answer, did people pay to have a street named after them? Did they apply, or, you know, was it they own the property at the time streets were developed, and then they could just name them. I really don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure you do.
I think I can make a statement that it's some of, well, or pretty much all of the above. In the early days, I mean, Broadway, Washington Street, Viola Street, those are properties that are owned by Putnam family, and they're going to lay them out. Circular Street's a good example. John Clark, he's going to buy the property and lay out the street. So yeah, you get to name it. Then there's eventually got to be a changeover where there's applications and, you know, things before city government, et cetera. And that changes over time. But in the early days, we do have proof that people were buying land and literally laying out the streets on their own dimes.
Yeah. Somebody asked about, you know, what happened to some of the old hotels, and, you know, some were lost to fire. Others were just change in travel and the advent of the automobile. You know, people didn't come to Saratoga as much as they once did for the entire summer. I guess, Charlie, would you want to add anything more to that?
No, your assumption is absolutely correct. You've got to understand, Saratoga Springs is going to be a summer destination. And in the early days, transportation was just slow and difficult. In the antebellum period, we've been in contact with the president of the History Museum in Mobile, Alabama, and we've been using diaries of a woman down there that talks about what she had to go through to come to Saratoga. She took sailing ships out of Mobile that brought her around Florida up to New York Harbor, and then Robert Fulton's invention up steamboats up the Hudson, and then finally stagecoaches. It took 8 hours by stagecoach to go from Albany to Saratoga in those early days. And it took her weeks to get here. So when she got here, she wasn't going to spend the weekend. She was going to stay the whole summer. And a lot of people did. So we built, and we built for that. Then 1832, we're going to get a lot more rail traffic, and then it's going to get bigger and faster. And eventually the automobile is going to do you in because you built too much. And it's Darwinian economics. The stronger survive, the weak die, and you can't fill at that level, so they can't pay their taxes. They're going to be torn down. A lot of people do remember there were fires, but they were a lot of them in the first renditions of them. They were built like the, for instance, the United States Hotel, 1824, and it burns in June of 1864. And when it comes down, there's a gap till they can rebuild it. But the last one is going to be torn down 1947. And the Grand Union is going to be pulled down in 52. And everything's going to be auctioned off, and it's going to be just rubble. And Congress Hall is going to come down, and we're going to put up the Spirit of Life, and we're going to make that part of Congress Park, and we'll just move on. But it was basically, we had outgrown them, and they were replaced by more efficient, smaller hotels. So yes, that's exactly right.
One other question that was asked, what were the Marvin brothers famous for? I should be able to answer this question myself, but I don't have my notes in front of me, Charlie, so you get to answer that.
Well, the two Marvin brothers were very instrumental. Elijah Benedict was kind of the founding father of the United States Hotel. And then the Marvin brothers, as they came into prominence, started to get involved with a lot of businesses in town, including the United States Hotel. They also ran for public office. They ended up on like the New York State Senate, and they ran for Congress. So they had a very integral part of Saratoga, and they were also self-made, so there was wealth, although they did have some family members that had some initial wealth. But they were able to buy in the early days a lot of the west side of town. Most of your tree streets, as I call them, the Elm and Elm Street and all those, that was their brainchild for affordable housing. The west side was always the first side of Saratoga that was constructed and settled. The east side is going to be pretty close to development after the American Civil War. So Marvin brothers, they were entrepreneurs, they were hotel owners, they were great public servants. They had done a lot for the city. And I think a lot of people in the early days were very, very appreciative of the fact that there was smaller frontage building lots and that houses could be purchased over there. And that's why the groundswell of support for them is so much, to name it, Marvin Square initially, and then finally Franklin Square. So
I apologize. There was one other question, and it was about why the area where the state park has remained undeveloped, or the area where the state park is remained undeveloped. And I think I could share a little bit, and Charlie, maybe you'll want to speak to that a little bit. But Spencer Trask, along with Charles Brackett, Senator Charles Brackett, they, with the pumping of the carbonic gas out of our spring waters, they were being harmed. Together, they passed legislation to protect our spring waters. And when legislation was passed, they created the reservation, the Spa Reservation, which is today known as the Spa State Park. And so that dates back to, is it 1909, Charlie?
The law, the anti-pumping law was 1908, but I think carbonic wasn't pushed out till 1909 or something like that.
But when they did that, that's when they created the reservation that is now known as the Spa State Park, protecting that land.
Yes, Samantha.
So that's the history of why the Spa State Park for over 100 years has not been developed, is because it's been set aside by visionaries to protect it. With that said, I think we're going to end our evening program. Again, Charlie, such a great, wonderful wealth of knowledge. We appreciate everybody who participated. Everybody who contributed to help support us, our members. We're so grateful to everyone. And we will have a Black History program towards the end of this month. So please keep your eyes open for that, and you'll learn something else about our history and why it's important to preserve our history and our architecture and all that goes with it. And again, kudos to Charlie, and thanks to the Saratoga Springs History Museum for their outstanding collection, the George S. Bolster collection, and they're also worthy of support. So thank you and have a great night, and we hope to see you soon. Oh, one more thing, save the date for the Historic Homes Tour on Saturday, May 13th, and the porch party, which will take place Thursday, June 15th. And we already have some really great houses lined up. So hopefully we'll see you there as well. Good night, everyone. Thank you so much.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.